Namaskar. I would have loved to speak in the languages of these poets, but I am sorry. I don't know these languages, and I regret that I cannot use my own language, Hindi, here, because you will not follow Hindi. So I have to use the language of our erstwhile masters. Although later on, we also ruled over them. Our man also became the Prime Minister of England. So now we have virtually internalized the language. Still, I don't feel at home. And I always hold it at bay, because it's not my language. But this is how poetry travels. Poetry in one language travels with the feet of another language. And this is how poetry travels throughout the world. This moment while we are here, Radosi, Rumi and Sadi, they are also there in Iran. And they are also here with us. This is how poetry keeps moving on and circulating in the world. Whenever a war breaks out, whenever there is violence, poetry is there as an antidote to that. And poetry again is here. The poets and the poems that we heard in all these sessions, they have opened up a new world for us. We people, that is the people from my generation, we are almost from the twilight zone. But even for us, poetry had stopped in English with Ceci Massini, John Ashbery and Ginsberg. But now a new world is opening up. We didn't know about this world. This is new poetry. This is poetry that is not cerebral as it used to be during the modern period. It's poetry very much like Indian poetry. And it's Asian poetry in its spirit, although it comes all the way from Italy, Slovenia, and many other parts. And for that, we thank the Raza Foundation. We thank our esteemed poet and critic, Shri Ashok Vajpeyi. We are grateful to them. They have opened up new windows on world poetry. This is how poetry travels. And poetry often enters the world in the darkest of hours. At times, knocking at the door. At times, still delayed. Slyly. At times, invading our dreams. This is how poetry works. Many a time it was declared poetry is dead. Poetry will die. But poetry, like a cat, has proverbial 9 lives, or even 99 lives, or even more than that. It has so many lives. This is how poetry circulates in the world. There is not a place in the world, there is not a language in this world where there is no poetry. If there is language, if there is human being, poetry is there. So now, my job is very limited. I have to invite our esteemed poets, and I must add, from the side of our fellow poets, from India, from Hindi in particular, that we have learned a lot from your poetry. This is extremely new kind of poetry. It defies all violence. It challenges the rulers and it talks truth to them. This is really great. And this is what poetry should do. It must say no, and also it must say yes to life. So with that, I invite, we have our guests today, Indre Valantinaite from Lithuania, Sinan Antun from Iraq, Gregor Podlogar from Slovenia, and Indre Saheli from Italy. So first I request Indre Valantinaite to come and make a presentation. Would you like that?
Just tell me. Maybe this one's closer to you, so it will be more comfortable. And I can make this trip to the second microphone. Dear audience, this is a very special time, and it's even extremely hard to make speech because things I wanted to say, for example, I planned to say in the morning. Now, things are changing so quickly. The world is changing while we are having SANSAAR festival here. Really gathered all of us from all over the world. It's been difficult to collect the words, but I understand that poetry, each of us who creates, not only of course poetry, but now we're speaking about poetry, that it's a great responsibility these days. And I do believe that some poems have the power, the same power as prayers. And I always say we have to be very careful of our thoughts, of our feelings. We have to discipline ourselves to check what's in our minds, to keep ourselves pure, clean. And then we can expect to become this clear channel to translate it into words, the things which are hardly can be put into words. And that can make us strong, and that can make us fearless in the times when we don't know what will happen tomorrow, we don't know what will happen in 2 hours. We'll just read the news, we follow them constantly. So even though they say, there was such, scientists made this percentage that only 2% in all nations read poetry. They are interested in poetry, only 2%. So in Lithuania it's very, very small, in my country it's a very, very small amount of people. And still, I do believe it can make a great difference. So we just talked about the poems and how many lives the poetry has. I always say that the poem lives as many lives, as many languages it is translated to. So thank you very much for this opportunity, so we can have one more life here while visiting India, while visiting New Delhi. And as we are gathered here by Raza Foundation, I think it is extremely important to notice that all the artists, first of all, they are poets. No matter, you can be a dancer, you can be a painter, actor, but first of all, if you're a good artist, if you're a real artist, you'll be a poet. Just we translate it into words, and the artists translate it into colors, shapes, movements, melodies. So I think that poetry is a base. It's a base, and it's a soul thing. Poems can awake soul. I don't know what is more important to tell, because we have one thing, I do believe we have immortal soul. So everything we see, all the material goods, everything we can touch, it will disappear in I don't know how many years, but everything what we can touch, it won't last long. And our bodies also, they are very fragile, and we have shortage. So I think the asset, the treasure we have, each of us, human being, has, it's our soul. And the best mirror to see your soul, to see the things which are unimaginable even, to have this connection with your heart, is a poem. I always talk about the poetry as a mirror to yourself, to the reader, and to the whole world. Some time ago, I discovered that things I wrote 20 years ago, they have fulfilled. They really became reality. And then I haven't really had a clue about it. I haven't even imagined that. That means the soul knows, and it speaks to you, and it contacts you. It says hello, because it's like calling to your inner self. So it taught me a lot. The poetry taught me a lot. I think it helped me to understand who am I for sure. And it helped me to be brave. For example, like not to fear things we do not know, because after Ukraine, as Katerina talked here before in the first session, Lithuanians also, because we are quite close to Russia, we started thinking, we go to sleep and we don't know, will we wake up in our safe in the same room, in our warm bed. People are really scared, and it dramatically changes their psychological, how they do feel. Some of them have, the survival kit ready in the basement, all the documents ready, all the kids, everything. It's like for a few years, they just change the water, look at that it would be in a good date, and they wait. And we sometimes laugh that we poets, we say, does anybody has the poetry book in that survival kit? Because it might help you sometime to survive in the very, I don't know, basement or whatever, but we don't know what can happen. And I'm standing here like, I'm safe. And we appreciate a lot. And we help Ukrainians. And Ukrainians not only travel, they travel as a poet. So their poetry and Ukrainian art, it blossomed while they are suffering, unbearable. So there's very, very strange things happening. And poetry right now in Lithuania, when the war started, it also, as a shield, as a sword, people started needing it. Before, it was there. They were not so much, like it's growing, like interested in poetry, it's growing constantly. And I think it's terrible to say this, but I think that sometimes people, as a human soul, because I don't know God's plan, of course it seems for us very cruel, because we don't know the whole picture, but sometimes understand that comfort makes us go very, easy way, but it's not the awakening path. So sometimes the suffering purifies you, makes you clean. And of course we will never choose it ourselves, because we're not masochists, so we will never choose it, but it's not up to us. Unfortunately, or maybe, so I just don't know God's plan. And we talked a lot about genocide, about Gaza, and it's constantly happening in the world. All from the beginning of the world, in various different places of the world, it's happening. The worstest crimes to humanity, they are continuing. Just the places are changing, and now as we are so global, we know everything in minutes, all the news. So many years ago we didn't know it. So in Lithuania, we had this in the Second World War, a lot of Jews, like millions of Jews were killed, thousands of Jews, 10,000 of Jews. And it's the biggest amount, if we say, if we took a percentage, it's the biggest amount in the world. So we had this on the other side. So, you know, we are speaking about Gaza. There is a different story in Lithuania, which was very, touched very deeply. And I'm living I'm renting a flat in Vilnius, in the place where 12 Jews were saved. It was like in a time where thousands of thousands killed. There were 12 Jews saved just under the German office. It's really an unbelievable story. And somehow I really felt that it related to me. I said that would I be able to behave like this? It doesn't matter the nationality of a person. It's a life, it's a soul you have to save if you are able to do. Despite your, will you be able to do it? So I think it's very important. And I would like to just finish my speech with a poem. I read it in English. I didn't read it yesterday. It is called The Hiding Place, and it is really like autobiographical. It's written like few years ago, and it speaks also about the saving and about risking your life for others. Hiding Place. This year, I moved for the 5th time in my life. It's a building that once belonged to a convent to which a ward is attached, naming the righteous among the nations. More than a few Jews were hidden and saved between these walls. Friends said, "Oh, how peaceful it is here, but how much fear these walls have known." In reply, I answered, "But how much courage permeates the space, and the gratitude of all the lives saved." Yesterday, I had tea with my elderly neighbor, a closet in her bedroom, a mirror in the closet. Its edges have blackened from the humidity of human sight. Breathing in hope, breathing out fear. One after the other in equal measure. No one could have known that dark story would end. There is no threat to my life. I am well fed, healthy. No one persecutes me. Uniformed men do not march in the streets. It is love that swiftly quivers under my skin. I breathe in hope and breathe out fear, both in equal measure.
Thank you, Indre. Poetry has always been, perhaps, a hiding place for most of us, and especially for the vulnerable, for the weakest. Now I request Sinan and Doom to present his views on this.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure and honor to be here, even in these difficult moments. I don't have anything prepared. I have a few thoughts that I've jotted down. I grew up in Arabic. Arabic is my mother tongue, and some poets said that the language is the umbilical cord that is always attached, no matter how old we get. But one of the definitions of poetry, and I think something that's so fascinating about poetry is that we've been talking about it all morning, and it's almost impossible to define. One of the definitions of poetry in Arabic is saying the unsayable, which simultaneously seems impossible, but as we've seen today and yesterday, it's always possible to say something differently and something new. But it's a challenge to come after all these wonderful presentations and try to say something different. It's a cliche in Arabic that poetry is the archive of the Arabs. And growing up in Arabic, poetry is something like oxygen. I always jokingly say to the Americans who don't understand poetry very well that in the Arab world, poetry is like football in Brazil. Everyone thinks they are going to be a football player, and most of them give up, but some don't give up. But no, it's just to say, which is what I said to you, in arriving here in parts where we feel at home because it's closer to our culture, but parts of the global south where poetry still matters in the lives of people. So it is kind of coming home, as was mentioned before. And there's something very fascinating in the language, in the vocabulary, the critical vocabulary of Arabic, and I'm quoting this from Mahmoud Darwish, one of my favorite poets, who pointed out that a line of poetry in Arabic, in prosody, is called bait. And bait also means home. And this is one of the themes that I want to talk about, which are so significant for so many of us, is that how poetry becomes a space that shelters those who don't have place, and becomes a place in and of itself that we often visit unknowingly, because it's also a mobile place that we can take with us wherever we go. We were talking about this yesterday, and I've noticed that at critical moments when one's homeland is being bombed or invaded, oftentimes people resort to poetry, because unlike analysis or information or news, poetry has the ability to condense a huge amount of information and sentiments in very few words. And I think it was Carlos Williams who said, one cannot get the news from poetry, but many men die every day for lack of what's found there. Sorry, I'm getting old and forgetting all of these things. And also Wordsworth saying that poetry is the essence of human knowledge. And when I read that when I was a teenager, I was dismissive because it didn't sound very rational to me. But as I mature, hopefully, I come to understand that it's true actually, with actual examples. For example, recently scientists discovered that trees do communicate. They've proven that. But poets have been saying this for 3,000 years, right? But no one believed them. And to bring it home to, well, before I talk about Iraq, but I wanted to say that also one of the central tropes of old Arabic poetry was this standing before the ruins, which you brought up in Rural Place, which had something to do with life in the Arabian Peninsula and elsewhere, where people had to move, nomads, to look for food and water, and also there was always separation. So almost all of the classical Arabic poems must start with standing before the ruins or the abandoned encampments of the beloved. And the poet stands and wonders how could it be that where there was life, it's all gone now, and where there was a beloved, they're not here anymore. And then the two imaginary companions tell the poet, enough crying, big boys don't cry, let's move on. And then there is a journey. And for the longest time, especially the Western critics, the Orientalists, many of whom were very prejudiced in the way they approached non-Western cultures, thought that this was just literal, only about a beloved and an encounter. But later, some of them came to realize, and many of us come to realize, that it's actually about a very central paradox about our existence as a species, is that time changes everything. So that's standing before the ruins because everything changes. And sadly, that trope for me in the recent decades, because of all of the destruction in Iraq and in Palestine and in Syria and in Yemen and now in Iran and elsewhere, and further afield, is that it is central to stop, which is what poets have to do, pause before what history does, what time with a capital T does, and say something on behalf of the others. It started out where poets used to speak for tribes or for ethnic communities, and things change in the modern period, but still, I was just thinking today that somehow poets are the ones who sacrifice themselves to become these censors that receive before everyone else all of these mixed emotions. Moving on to what shaped me personally is that I grew up in Iraq during a vicious dictatorship of Saddam Hussein and during a long war with our neighbor Iran, which most of us were against, and then the 1991 first US war, which included 2 months of bombing. To quote James Baker, back then said gleefully, we bombed them back to the pre-industrial age. During dictatorship, there was heavy censorship, of course, because the state controlled the narrative and the discourse and our history. But I want to bring it back to poetry as a form of knowledge and history, is that Iraqi poets who were in exile because of their political positions, recording their poetry on cassettes. And these cassettes were smuggled back to us in Iraq, where we got an alternative idea and a counter history and a counter narrative. For those of us who are just teenagers and seeing, frankly, many Iraqi, Arab, and European intellectuals come to Baghdad to praise the secular regime of Saddam Hussein, which was at the time fighting fundamentalist Iran. As a teenager, you think, could I be politically more insightful than these very famous authors and writers and poets? So now I'm one of many who credit those poets for giving us an education about our history and our country, and giving us a political compass in a way. I won't go into examples of how poetry was actually very significant in the Arab uprisings of 2011. And it so happens that the uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt all recited the same line of poetry by a very famous Tunisian poet, Abu Qasim al-Shabi, which says, if a people one day desire life, then fate must give in to their desires. I'm just saying it because also the Western pundits are always at pains to tell us this Arab street is dead, this society is dead, this society is not vibrant. I wasn't planning on saying this, but because when I went to the US in '91 to study and to live there, all of these experts would say there will never be an uprising in Middle Eastern countries because of religion, or because of this, or because of that, which is of course ridiculous, if not racist. Then when the uprisings took place, they were confused for a while. So then they said, oh, it's Twitter, and it's Facebook, to kind of attribute everything to the West. And you are all familiar with the one-way street of progress and modernity and whatnot. Now I have to always be what they say, the party pooper, because we poets and a lot of people who love poetry sometimes have a romanticized view of poets. Unfortunately, a lot of poets also are regime poets. And they write propaganda poets, and they write poems that praise sultans and emirs and presidents. We know of many examples of that, especially nowadays in the Arab world in these rich sheikdoms. They bring in all of these intellectuals. But I want to say that in the so-called West, or in the United States, where it wasn't a dictatorship and people had a larger space of freedom of expression, very few poets said anything about the wars in Iraq or Afghanistan or elsewhere. I went only once to this so-called annual conference for creative writing programs in the United States. This is in 2003, and there were really 1,000 panels, and there was one panel on the poetry of war. And if you look back at all of the major US poets, very few of them, Charles Simic and a few others, said anything about war. So as you said, which I believe, a poet is a citizen and is responsible. So silence is complicity, and it's not acceptable. And poetry also, good poetry, I think, saves language from debasement. And language is debased every day by regimes, by fascism, by fundamentalism, and by empire. And by the way, in the US, they know that after 9/11, the United States government had a whole study about how to deal with language and how to control language. And just before we came for this session, the media, of course, is repeating the same language that the aggressors are using. So this attack against the Iranian people, let's not forget, it's always against people, is being called a preventative attack. And sadly, the media is repeating that. And now we're talking about poetry, not about media. And I agree with you completely. I was going to say, which I believe in, even as a faithless person, that poetry is a form of prayer, an existential prayer, to anchor us within this mysterious universe. And I forgot his name, but a French philosopher said that how poetry is one of the few activities in the world today that can be outside and beyond this circulation of profit and commodification. Because let's face it, it's one of the few activities that you carry out without any intention of making money. It's on the other, it's you're losing money, but it's completely outside of that, outside of commodification and outside of this network of profit. And it's really an important form of defense of what it means to be human at this age when machines and corporations and capital is not only destroying the planet, but every sentient being and destroying us as well. And so poetry is for a lot of people a form of defense, a form of anchoring themselves as human beings. And again, in moments of war, in moments of difficulty, in moments of grief, poetry comes to save us and to remind us of who we are. So, and thank you so much for being here and for giving us the opportunity to think out loud about poetry and to celebrate poetry. Poetry is also a form of hospitality, I think, in allowing the other, the imaginary other or the real other into our lives. And thank you so much. Shukran.
Shukran, Sivanantu. Shukran. As you said, poetry is the mother language of humanity. And also, that poetry can never be commercialized. It cannot be changed into a commodity or money. But there is always a threat to poetry, as he said that in his Arab world, especially in sheikdoms, there are poets who are court poets. But the job of poetry is to knock the crown off the head of the ruler. If it doesn't do that, it ceases as poetry. This is what poetry must do. So now I request Gregor Podlogar to make his presentation.
Yeah, cheating. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for the invitation. It is truly an honor for me to perform at this festival. Let me begin by pointing out that I am at the festival with the right title, because the world SANSAAR, is in fact the central theme of all of my poetry collections. And as I already wrote in the short text in the festival materials, the relationship between the world and ourselves is the core theme of my poetry. My comment will be brief and will represent today's image of the world and therefore somehow be orientated also toward the future. Okay, let me begin. We are living in pivotal times. It's true that probably all times were pivotal, but this time we are genuinely witnessing great changes. Why that so? The world that was shaped after the Second World War has ended, has died. The rules that, at least on a paper, once applied no longer live today. I am referring to international law and human rights, of course. International law has no longer ceased to function. As we can see also in the light of what is now happening in Gaza, Ukraine, and at this very moment in Iran, it reflects under understanding of politics as a form of power. Whoever is stronger can do whatever they wish. We have known this in the past, but now it is appearing in its purest form. Of course, the rules were not the same for everyone, but they were founded on the right principles. I'm speaking of human rights here. Let me recall a few passages. Article 1. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Article 3. Everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. Article 5. No one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. And there are two other things that should be mentioned here, and that is the Internet and artificial intelligence. The Internet has changed the human being and society at least as profoundly as the printing press once did. But the printing press had largely positive consequences. It enabled many people to become educated, to discover new, imaginative worlds, and to have stories and poems constantly with them in books. The printing press made it possible for poems to be alive in other languages. Of course, the Internet has enabled all of this as well, and perhaps that was one of its many purposes, at least in the beginning, before it was hijacked by the Big Five. Today, the Internet is a machine, and we are its subjects. And that is why it's true that we live in what Yanis Varoufakis called techno-feudalism. Why I'm saying all this? Because of the language, or languages. Language is a living creation that changes because of human beings. It is the medium that shows us the world and life are one, as Ludwig Wittgenstein once wrote in his diaries. So, the limits of my language mean the limits of my world. Why is this relationship fundamental? Because poetry always emerged in relation to the world, and even if the poet writes only about him or herself, it includes the world as well. Therefore, poetry is never immune to current events in the world. On the contrary, it responds to them. Not as a pamphlet, but as a deep sensitivity, as a compassion with everyone and everything. Because of empathy. Yes, empathy, which machines do not have. Poets are guardians of empathy. They are the medium through which empathy is expressed and comes alive in language. The world of poetry is dual. On the one hand, is turned toward the world of nature, which is internal in its essence. In its circles, trees, sun, sky, animals, all of this in rhythm of life and death. On the other hand, the world of poetry is also social world, which depends on general, global, and increasingly technological developments. It's always been so, and it will always be so. Therefore, we can remake Wittgenstein's sentence that philosophy ought to be written only as a form of poetry, to poetry can also be written as a form of philosophy. Yes, little birds, blue skies, and warm sunshine, but also Gaza, Ukraine, microplastics. This is poetry. Everything in one place, or simply, everything in everything. Thank you.
Thank you, Gregor. Now I request Indre Saheli to make his presentation.
Thank you. Supposedly, and this is one of the first lectures I attended when I was a university student 20 years ago. That really stuck with me. And this professor said, you know, it doesn't matter which community you look at across the planet, what really makes us universal when you look at our anthropological record, our archaeological record, there are three things that bind us universally. We do something with our dead, whether we burn them, we bury them, we do something with our dead. We have laws prohibiting incest. That is actually also universal because there is an understanding that those kinds of unions can be harmful in the in the offspring they produce. And the third, and the one that's most relevant for this conversation, is that we write poetry. Now, I agree, poetry has 9 lives. Poets have 1. Right? Poets have 1. And I think when we look at our civilizational record, the story that we get universally across it, and this is, I think, part of what forces us into the position of, and it's fortunately a good movement, into accepting and promoting empathy, is because we have to form that counterpoint to the main narrative that we read across civilization, which is nothing but destruction and exile, a continuous loop. Being banished from one's home lies at the root of our earliest stories, whether human or divine. As the Abrahamic traditions tell us, if disobeying God was our original sin, exile was our original punishment. In Genesis, Adam and Eve are expelled from Eden after eating the forbidden fruit. Their return forever barred. Tragedy, of course, also repeats itself when Cain murders his brother Abel and is exiled east of Eden. But it was in Babel, Mesopotamia, the Tower of Babel, towards the end of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, that one of our earliest poetic epics, the Lament for Urim, first depicted the vicious cycle of conquest and expulsion that has largely characterized our history. In the Lament for Urim, Ningal, the goddess of reeds, pleads before the great gods. And this is a quote: "I have been exiled from the city, I can find no rest." Bemoaning the destruction of her beloved Ur, one of our oldest cities on the planet, by the invading Elamites, Ningal cries out its name. And this is from the Lament for Urim. This is one of our oldest poems. O city, your name exists, but you have been destroyed. O city, your wall rises high, but your land has perished. Employing the refrain, woe is me, Ningal chronicles the annihilation of her world. I am one whose cows have been scattered. My small birds and fowl have flown away. My young men mourn in a desert they do not know. The Sumerian epic ends with a soft, sanguine prayer that Ningal's city may in fact one day be restored, unleashing one of our first literary archetypes, the hopeful exile. In fact, if the Lament for Urim is any indication, the very concept of recorded history and literature appears to spring out of the necessity of exile, preserving in our minds what had been bloodily erased on earth. In the presence of absence, which Mahmoud Darwish wrote only 2 years prior to his untimely death, and which was translated into English by Sinan Al-Tun. Let's remember here he's one of Darwish's best translators. Mahmoud Darwish wrote this: exile is not journeying. It is not moving back and forth, nor is it to dwell in longing. It may be a visit or a waiting room, what time does to you, or a departure of the self for another, to know and be in harmony with, or for the self to return to its skin. Each exile has its character, and every exile his characteristics. In exile, you train yourself to contemplate and admire what is not yours. Darwish's poems had a great effect on a poet whom I know Mr. Ashok invited to the festival, but I think perhaps because of inability to travel, he could not attend. But he's a poet that I've translated myself, Abdulatif Labi, the Moroccan poet. He founded the magazine Souf, which in the 60s was a great meeting place for the emerging post-independence revolutionary North African consciousness, meeting with Caribbean negritude, right? And in that first editorial, for the very first issue for the magazine, he said the following: poetry is the only means left to humanity to proclaim its dignity, to be more than just a number, so that his breath will remain forever imprinted and attested to by this cry. Iran has just been bombed. We saw this coming, but it didn't prepare me. Foreknowledge never does. In fact, it's taken all my energy to really stay here with you. I'm angry, my heart is full of sadness, pain, and loss. But this is also a moment to thank my peers and thank all of you, because I think being here and thinking through these things is actually exactly what we needed to do. But I wanted to read you a poem by the Iranian poet Mohsen Emadi, which was translated into Persian, from Persian into English by Lynn Coffin. So I think it's a perfect time to read this particular poem. In my language, every time somebody falls silent, a policeman is born. In my language, on the back of each frightened bicycle, 3,000 dead words are sitting. In my language, in murmurs, they make confessions. In whispers, they wear black. In silence, they get buried. My language is silence. Who will translate my silence? How can I cross this border? I don't have much more to say than that, so I will leave it on that particular note and hand things over back to our host. Thank you so much.
On behalf of the Raza Foundation, I thank the distinguished panel, but just a couple of sentences. In 1970, Mahmoud Darwish had come to India to receive the Afro-Asian Lotus Award. As you mentioned, I still remember the first collection of his poetry that we read and we gave upon, A Letter from Exile, a poet is in exile, but living in his own native language, always sending letters from exile to everybody. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. Yeah. So now we'll have a tea break. Tea and snacks for all of you. And let's, we're running just say 15 minutes late, so let's reassemble in 15 minutes. That's 5:15. A quick tea break for all of you. And then we continue. Can I have your attention, please? We will be beginning the evening session now. So now actually we've arrived at our 10th session, which is titled From the Book of Genocide. We have with us Sinan Antoon from Iraq. Sinan Antoon is a poet, novelist, translator, and scholar. He holds degrees from Baghdad, Georgetown, and Harvard, where he earned a doctorate in Arabic literature. His scholarly works include The Poetics of the Obscene. His essays and op-eds in English have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, and the World Literature Today. Translation of his poetry into English appeared as the Baghdad Blues and Postcards from the Underworld. He won the 2012 American Literary Translators Association Award. Antoon was a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study in Berlin in 2016. He is co-founder and co-editor of Italia and associate professor at the New York University. The Hindi translations for Sinan's poems will be read by Girdhar Rathi ji, जो कि हिंदी कवि है और हिंदी अंग्रेजी अनुवादक, आलोचक, पत्रकार और संपादक है. And the English translation will be read by Ashutosh, who is a fiction writer, a critic, and a journalist.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor and a pleasure to be invited here. Thank you for the hospitality. I am a literary translator, so I know the joy and the struggles of translation. Walter Benjamin, the great German Jewish intellectual, said something along the lines that every text stays in mourning until it is translated. So thank you so much, Mr. Gregor, for giving my poems a new life in Hindi, and thank you, Ashutosh, for reading them in English, in the colonial language, which will haunt us forever. So they will read in Hindi and then English, and then I will read in the Arabic.
ये कविताएं कवि ने खुद ही अंग्रेजी में अनुवादित की हैं. जिस किताब से की है उसका नाम है द बुक ऑफ जेनोसाइड, जिसको हम हिंदी में कह सकते हैं जाति संहार संहिता. एक तरह की संहिता ही है द बुक ऑफ जेनोसाइड, जाति संहार संहिता. तो तीन कविताएं हम पढ़ेंगे, फिर अंग्रेजी में 3 पढ़ेंगे और फिर मूल में अरबी में वो 3 कविताएं पढ़ेंगे. ऐसा कवि की इच्छा है. तो पहली कविता नव वर्ष की पूर्व संध्या पर सुना, हर्ड ऑन न्यू ईयर्स ईव. एक युद्ध दूसरे से कभी ना थको, हम चलते रहें अनंत. एक किताब अपनी पड़ोसी से, कोई तो याद करेगा हमें कि उसकी उंगलियां हमारे वर्क छू लें और जगा दें हमें इस गर्द से भले ही मिनट भर को. आशा है रहेंगे हम संग साथ, और अगर आरी से कटें हमारी पुश्तें, हमारे अवशेष रहें आसपास. गोया 2 कुर्सियां एक आलीशान मेज के इर्द गिर्द, एक बादल दूसरे से. क्या तुम थक गए सफर करते करते? चिंता मत करो, जल्दी ही हम सब जाकर सो रहेंगे समुद्र में। समुद्र अपने आप से उब गया मैन किनारों से, और इन पर आयत हर एक से काश में बन जाता बादल और उड़ जाता सुदूर। दूसरी कविता है नया ईश्वर, द न्यू गॉड। हमने नक्शे पर नजर डाली, तमाम नदियां जो पार की हमने उस नए ईश्वर की टोह में। बिब्लिकल हमने नक्शे पर नजर डाली, हमारी तमाम नदियां जो पार की हमने उस नए ईश्वर की टोह में, जिसके बाबत सारे पादरी बताते थे जन्मा वह हमारी ही खातिर। जब हम जा पहुंचे वतन उसके, देखे हमने जत्थे उसके जुलूसे जनाजे में जाते, शामिल हो गए हम। उन्होंने बताया तमाम नदियां जो पार की उन्होंने उस नए ईश्वर की टोह में, जिसके बाबत सारे पादरी बताते थे मरा वह उन्हीं की खातिर। और तीसरी कविता है स्वर्ग में शरद। गाछ हैं सदाबहार, मध्यम बयारें गुदगुदाती हैं उनकी शाखाएं। बुजुर्गवार अखबार पढ़ते हैं, बच्चे खेलते हैं, माताएं करती निगरानी। अफवाहें फैली हैं कि एक और देवदूत ने कर ली आत्महत्या कर रहा।
I'll now read the English translation of these three poems. The first one, heard on New Year's Eve. One walk to another. May you never tire. May we go on forever. One book to its neighbor, hoping someone will remember us, that his fingers touch our leaves and rouse us from this dust if for only a minute. I hope we stay together, and if a saw were to break our backs, may our remains stay close by. Perhaps two chairs around an elegant table. One cloud to another. Are you tired of traveling? No worries. Soon we will sleep in the sea. A sea to itself. I am bored with these shores and with everyone on them. I wish I could become a cloud and fly far away. The new God. We looked at the map, all those rivers we had crossed, searching for that new God. The priest said he was born for our sake. When we reached his homeland, we found crowds marching in his funeral procession. We joined them. They told us of all those rivers they had crossed, searching for the new God. The priest said he had died for their sake. The last one, before the poet takes over. Autumn in heaven. Trees are evergreen, gentle winds tickle their branches. The elders read newspapers, children play, their mothers watch. There are rumors that another angel committed suicide last night.
بعض ما قالته الأشياء ليلة رأس السنة حرب لأخرى عسى ألا تكل وأن يكون حصادنا وفيرا كتاب لجاره عسى أن يتذكرنا أحد وتداعب أصابعه أوراقنا ليوقظنا من الغبار ولو للحظة شجرة لأخرى أتمنى أن نظل معا وإن قسم ظهرنا منشار فعسى أن تكون أشلاؤنا قريبة فربما نصير كرسيين حول طاولة أنيقة غيمة لأخرى أتعبت من السفر لا عليك عما قليل ننام في البحر وننسى أننا كنا البحر لنفسه مللت هذه الشطآن ومن عليها ليتني أصير غيمة لأهاجر إلى أرض جديدة الإله الجديد نظرنا إلى الخارطة كل هذه الأنهار عبرناها بحثا عن الإله الجديد قال الكهنة إنه ولد من أجلنا وحين اهتدينا إلى موطنه أبصرنا بشرا مثلنا يشيعونه في مواكب مهيبة مشينا معهم حدثونا عن كل تلك الأنهار التي عبروها بحثا عن الإله الجديد الذي قال الكهنة إنه مات من أجله الخريف في الجنة الأشجار دائمة الخضرة ريح خفيفة الكهول يقرؤون الجرائد الأطفال يلعبون الأمهات يراقبن وهمس يدور ملاك آخر انتحر الليلة الماضية
उरेहने ही वाला था वह दो एक सागर सो सके जहां आंसुओं के रेले उरेहने ही वाला था वह एक आसमान मृतकों की दीठ जहां जिंदा रही आती दूर के सितारों में उरेहने ही वाला था वह एक हाथ चित्र पर नहीं उड़ेगा उठाकर रख देगा हाथ राह देखेगा आएगा कोई करने तलाश उसकी लाश मलबे में अंग प्रत्यंग लिम्ब कवि का नोट है इसके साथ लिम्स बाह या हाथ या ऐसे ही किसी अन्य जीव जंतु के अंग जैसे पंख दुनिया के सबसे अधिक अंग विच्छेदित लोग गधा में दुनिया में सबसे अधिक डिसमेंबर्ड लोग गधा में इंसान दरख्त नहीं है उनके अंग दोबारा नहीं उगते मगर क्या होता है गजा में शरीर से विच्छेदित अंगों का क्या वे रखे जाते हैं जार में क्या वे रखे जाते हैं जार में इत्मीनान से इंतजार करते कब मिले हक उन्हें तन बदन में वापस जाने का जिनसे उन्हें किया जुदा मगर उनको सैंतने के वास्ते फॉर्मल डिहाइड नहीं है क्या वे फेंक दिए जाते हैं कूड़े में क्या वे किसी जगह आकर जुट जाते हैं क्या वे अगले ओलंपिक में प्रतियोगिता कर सकते हैं क्या टांगे दौड़ती रहती हैं बचने बमबारी से क्या हाथ घूंसे से आसमान को छलनी करते हैं क्या हाथ घूंसे से आसमान को छलनी करते हैं या बादलों से करते हैं फरियाद क्या वे दफन किए जाते हैं ताकि लोग जा सके खबर उस अंग की जो रहा उनके बदन में क्या वे भूत प्रेतों की फौज बन जाते हैं और अगली कविता है पुरातत्व आर्कियोलॉजी वह कोई पुरातत्व विज्ञानी नहीं है, वह कभी था नानबाजी, पर वो अब अपने घर के आगे उकड़ू बैठा रहता। घर कोई पुरातत्व स्थल नहीं है, सिर्फ 9 साल पुराना है, लेकिन 101 दिन पहले हो गया वह एक यादगार। जानता नहीं वह हड्डियों के नाम, पर जानता है वो किस किस की हड्डी है। पहुंचता रहता है वह अपने आंसू की गर्द और नमक, तरतीब से रखता लकड़ी के तख्त पर अपने बच्चों की रीढ़ और पसलियां, 2 अदद खोपड़ी और अपनी बीवी के बालों का गुच्छा।
In 3 points. The first one, a hand. He was going to draw a sea or two where the trails of tears could sleep. He was going to draw a sky where the eyes of the dead could go on living in distant stars. He was going to draw a hand drawing, but he will not draw. He will extend his hand and wait for someone to find his corpse in the river. Limbs. Just a short note by the poet. Gaza has the largest number of amputees in the world. Humans are not trees. Their limbs do not grow back. But what happens to amputated limbs in Gaza? Are they kept in jars to wait patiently for the right to return to their bodies from which they were removed, but there isn't any formaldehyde to preserve them? Are they then thrown away into the trash? Do they congregate somewhere? Could they compete in the next Olympics? Do legs keep running, fleeing the bombing? Do heads punch the sky or beseech a cloud for help? Are they buried? So one could visit a body part that lived in their body. Do they become an army of ghosts? The last one, archaeology. He is not an archaeologist. He was once a confectioner, but now he squats in front of his house. The house is not an archaeological site. It is only 9 years old, but 100 days ago, it became a relic. He doesn't know the names of the bones, but he knows who they belong to. He wipes off the dirt and the salt of his tears. He arranges what he has excavated so far on a wooden plank. His children's vertebrae and ribs, 2 skulls, and a lock of his wife's hair.
I should add, although it's obvious that some of these poems were written in the last 2 years, sometimes after watching some of the images. So the last poem is about an actual person who was doing that. شجرة العائلة. أسماؤهم حروف سوداء مسجات على قماش أبيض. أسماء 3 أجيال خطتها على عجل يد متعبة. 6 أحفاد، الأم والأب والجد والجدة. صف طويل من الجثث المكفنة، غصن آخر من شجرة العائلة سيحمل على عجل إلى المقبرة. أطراف. يقطع البشر أغصان الأشجار فتعود من جديد، أما أغصان الأطفال فلا تعود بعد البتر. ما مصيرها؟ هل تخزن في حاويات زجاجية لتنتظر بصبر العودة إلى الأجساد التي اقتلعت منها؟ لكن الفورمالدهايد محروم من الدخول إلى غزة. هل تلقى في العراء أو في القمامة، أم أنها تنتظر من ينتشلها من تحت الركام؟ هل تتجمهر في مكان ما وتشكو بصمت؟ هل تستمر سيقان الأطفال بالعدو هربا من القنابل؟ هل تطرق الأيادي أبواب السماء أم أنها تصلي؟ هل سينظم العالم أولمبياد السلام ويسمح للأطراف المبتورة أن تتنافس فيه؟ هل هي مدفونة في مكان ما كي يزور قبورها أصحابها؟ هذا إذا ما ظلوا على قيد الحياة. وحين يموتون هل ستكون أرواحهم مبتورة الأطراف؟ حمامة تلعب الشطرنج. أجلس وحدي تحت شجرة الجينكو. This one was not right. I lost the poem. So you interpret it whichever way. أجلس وحدي تحت شجرة الجينكو. أحببتها أكثر منذ عرفت أنها من سلالة منقرضة، وأنها الوحيدة التي ظلت حية في هيروشيما بعد الهجوم النووي. تأملت رقعة الشطرنج المصبوغة على الطاولة أمامي كأنها ساحة حرب مقفرة. حطت حمامة على الجانب المقابل. أخرجت هاتفي والتقطت صورة لها. لم تهرب. أتبحثين عن فتاة أيتها الجائعة؟ أم تريدين أن نلعب الشطرنج؟ المربعات خاوية، فالملوك في قصورهم والوزراء يكذبون على الشاشات والجنود يصيدون الجياع هناك.
भजन शाम शुरू में थी चोट, खंजर ने किया घाव अपनी ही शक्ल का और फिर चली गई फिर किसी दूसरे बदन की तलाश। शुरू में थी चोट, खंजर ने किया घाव अपनी ही शक्ल का और फिर चली गई फिर किसी दूसरे बदन की तलाश में। घाव रोया 40 दिन फिर पुर गया, बन गया वो दिल और रेंगता चला गया फिर किसी दूसरे बदन की तलाश। अंग भंग डिसमेंबरमेंट। देह ने या उसकी नकलची नकली आवाज ने कहा, जाओ अब तुम सब आजाद हो। देह ने या उसकी नकलची नकली आवाज ने कहा, जाओ अब तुम सब आजाद हो। उड़ गई आंखें सुदूर दूसरी आंखों के झुंडों में जा मिली, जिनसे भर उठा था आकाश। सूर्य की रोशनी लगभग अंधियार थी। अलविदा कहे बगैर होंठ हुए अलहदा। एक लगा खोजने कोई नया चेहरा, दूसरा किसी ऐसे होंठ को सुने जो उसके शिकवे। क्लांत जीव खोजने लगी किसी गूंगे का मुंह, जिसमें कर दे विश्राम। भाग पड़े हाथ परस्पर विदा देते, टकराते तालियां। दाहिनी टांग नजर आई भयभीत और हिचकती सी भी, फिर दौड़ी जा पहुंची बाई के बराबर। नाक तो गिर पड़ी जमीन पर। जहां तक दिल का सवाल है वह धड़कता रहा एकाकी, जब तक न कुछ किसी आवारा पैर ने उसको। क्या बात है, क्या बात है। काली तितली। यह काली तितली 1 मिनट है जो मुर्दा रात से बचकर भाग निकली। खोज रही है गुलाब रात की मदार पर चढ़ाने को, पर इसकी उंगलियां नहीं हैं और गुलाब भारी है।